Hey guys, welcome to day 1 of our 15 days to Spring Boot Mastery. In this video, let us get an introduction to Spring Framework. We will understand what is Spring, why we need Spring Framework, what are the advantages of using Spring Framework, what are Spring modules, and few other fundamental concepts related to Spring Framework. Now, let us get started. These are the topics that we will be discussing in this particular video. What is Spring? Why Spring? What is dependency injection? What are the advantages of Spring Framework? Spring module? What is the meaning of IoC? What is an IoC container? The types of IoC container? What is a Spring Bean? And few other fundamental concepts. You might be wondering, why should I learn Spring Framework instead of directly jumping into Spring Boot? Spring Framework will help you to understand the fundamental concepts of Spring, which will help you to work with Spring Boot easily and effectively. Okay, now let us understand what is Spring. What is Spring? Spring is an open source framework which is used for developing enterprise applications in Java. With Spring Framework, you can develop standalone applications, that is console-based applications. These applications will run only in the console. Web applications, REST APIs. With the help of Spring Framework, you can also build microservices. Spring is lightweight and it supports POJO-based programming. What is POJO? POJO means plain old Java objects. Whenever you are working with Java, the Java applications does not have any external dependencies. Provided you are not working with database, you can create an interface, you can create implementation class and you can work with Java comfortably. Similarly, in case of Spring also, you can work with simple Java classes. Okay. Why do we need Spring Framework? Spring uses the concept of dependency injection to develop loosely coupled applications. What is the meaning of dependency? You all know the literal meaning of dependency. If I am dependent for something on a particular person, then it is called as dependency. Let me put it in simple terms. Here I have a mobile. Assume that this particular mobile uses a specialized charger. This means wherever I go, I need to take my charger together with the mobile because the mobile is dependent on that charger. Without the charger, the mobile cannot be charged. It means the relationship between these two is they are tightly coupled. I hope it is clear. Now, of late, most of the mobiles can use C-type charger. Assume my mobile also can use C-type charger. It means I am not dependent on my own charger. I can just take the mobile and go wherever I want. If I want to charge it, I can use the charger of any other person also, provided it is C-type. In this case, the dependency between the charger and the mobile is reduced. So, it is loosely coupled. Similarly, when you are working with Java applications, you will be creating multiple classes. There are scenarios where the classes are dependent on each other. This means that they are tightly coupled. Let me explain this with a simple example. Assume I have two classes. One is an employee class and the other one is an address class. Address class has two instance variables, city and state. String city and string state. I have created a default constructor, a parameterized constructor, getter setter methods and toString. My employee class also has few properties as in employee name, employee ID which is of type integer, and now I have address. Address is not of type string but it is of type address class itself. This means employee class has an instance of address. Employee class is dependent on address. Okay, in employee class also I am having default constructor, parameterized constructor, getter methods and toString. Now I need to create an employee object and assign values for employee name, employee ID and address. How do we do that? Either we can go in for a parameterized constructor or you can use setter methods. Let me show you both. Now first I am creating an employee object using a default constructor, new employee, and then I can call employee.setEmployeeName. I'll give the name as Priya. Employee.setEmployeeID as 10. Now I need to set address. What will I pass as parameter? emp.setAddress. So in this case, I need an address object that has to be passed as parameter. So we should already have our address object ready. Now I am creating my address object. Address is equal to new address of, and here I can pass the city and state. City Bangalore, state Karnataka. Okay. And I am passing address as parameter. I hope it is clear. Now the employee class is dependent on address object. So for that, first we need to create the address object and explicitly we are injecting the address object using setAddress method. This is one way. The other way is, while creating the employee object itself, new employee, during this time itself, I can use a parameterized constructor. I can pass the name, the ID and the address object. Okay. So what is the meaning of it? The employee object is dependent on address object and the address object is added to the employee object either using the setter method or using a parameterized constructor. This is the scenario that we do in case of Java application. As a Java developer, it is mandatory that first you need to create the address object and add the address object to the employee object. Suppose say I don't have a parameterized constructor. I am using setter method. If I forget to inject the address object into the employee object and if I am trying to get city or if I am trying to get state, then there are scenarios where I may get exception. It is mandatory that you need to check whether the dependencies are added to the class properly. If they are not added, then your application will break. Just like how I told you. If my mobile is using a specialized charger, it is mandatory that I need to carry it everywhere. If I don't carry my charger, then in that case I cannot charge my mobile. Similarly, the dependencies needed for a class should be added properly by the developer. If somewhere you are missing it, then the application will break because they are tightly coupled applications. Then, what is the use of Spring Framework? Spring Framework uses the concept of dependency injection. What exactly is the meaning of it? Spring is responsible for injecting the dependencies that are needed for our class. Here, I have my employee class. Employee class is dependent on address. So, I need to inform Spring that my employee class is dependent on address. So, address should be injected into employee object. So, who will do that? Spring Framework is responsible for performing this operation. Okay. Now, how will Spring inject the dependencies? Either using the setter method or using the constructor. How will Spring know that address is a dependency of employee? So, for that we will be using certain annotation. I hope it is clear the concept of dependency injection. When I say dependency injection, the dependencies needed for the class is injected automatically by Spring Framework. Now, the relationship or the dependency between the two classes is completely reduced. This will help us to develop loosely coupled applications. Let us go back to the slide. Spring uses the concept of dependency injection to develop loosely coupled applications. We will still more see about dependency injection. Spring has many modules that supports enterprise development easier. In case of Spring, if you want to simply create a console based application, Spring has a module which is called a Spring Core module. If you want to develop a web application, you need to use the module Spring Web module. If you want to integrate your Spring application with a database, then you can either use Spring JDBC module or spring-data-jpa module. So, in case of Spring, it is like plug and play. If you want to create just a web application without database, plug web module. If you want to integrate your application only with the database, but it is not a REST API, plug in spring-data-jpa module. Okay? We will discuss about the modules going forward. Okay. Now, what is dependency injection? Dependency injection is a concept where the dependencies needed by the class is injected automatically by the framework. The same example I have given over here. I have two classes, employee and address. Employee class has address as instance variable. Now, in this case, address object should be injected into employee object. See this example, just like what we have seen earlier. Both the classes are having their own properties, default constructor, parameterized constructor, getter setter methods and toString. Now, address object has to be injected into employee. How do we do that? Either using a parameterized constructor or using the setter method, just like how we have seen. Creating an address object, creating an employee object, injecting the address object into employee object. If you are working with a constructor, you need to go in for a parameterized constructor. This is what we have been doing. With the help of Spring framework, we don't have to do that. Spring is responsible for creating the address object and injecting the address object into employee. Guys, you need to remember, when you are working with Spring framework, you will not be using new keyword. Meaning to say that you will not be creating objects for your class. You will inform Spring that I am having these many classes. Please create objects for my class and inject the appropriate dependencies. In this scenario, I will inform Spring I am having two classes, employee and address. Please create object for both the classes and inject address object into employee object. How do we do that? We use certain types of annotation. Going forward, we will see that. Okay. What are the advantages of Spring? Guys, you might be feeling that you are learning more of theory, but these are fundamental concepts. Going forward, in the upcoming videos, we will be doing many hands-on examples. Only if this is clear, you will be able to work with the practical examples easily. Now, let us see the advantages of Spring. Spring helps to develop enterprise applications, REST API, web applications. Spring does not need an application server. Earlier, if I have to create an enterprise application, I need to use an application server like JBoss or WebLogic. But now it is not required. We can use the Tomcat server, which is a web server. And in case of REST APIs, you don't have to even use an external server. You will be working with an embedded Tomcat server, which is provided by Spring. Okay. Spring has lightweight IoC containers. What are these IoC containers? IoC, inversion of control. These are like supervisors. The moment you create your application, these containers are responsible for identifying the classes in your application for whom you need to create object. What are the dependencies that has to be injected for those particular classes? Yeah, we will be talking about the IoC container now. Okay. Spring is good for deploying applications on computers with limited memory and CPU resources. See guys, actually earlier we were working with EJB. In case of EJB, it is very heavyweight, meaning to say that the external libraries are more. In case of Spring, it is not like that. So you can work with computers with limited memory. Spring can integrate with any other framework. With Spring, you can integrate struts, which behaves like a front controller. With Spring, you can integrate Hibernate, so that if you want to connect to the database, you can integrate logging frameworks. You can integrate JEE and JDK timers. Spring helps to translate the technology specific exceptions into consistent unchecked exceptions. What exactly is the meaning of it? This is very important. Whenever you are working with Java applications, if you are working with a database, the database throws SQL exception. So it is mandatory that you need to use try catch. And if you are creating your own project specific exception, it is your choice. Either you can create it as a runtime exception, that is an unchecked exception, or checked exception. If you have created it as a checked exception, it is mandatory that you need to handle it try catch. If you have created it as a runtime exception like arithmetic or null pointer or number format, you don't have to handle it. The exception will be thrown in the console. In case of Spring also, whatever exceptions are coming from the backend will be converted into runtime exceptions by Spring automatically, and it will be thrown to the console only. You will not be encountering any kind of checked exception. That is, you don't have to use try catch. All the backend exceptions are converted into runtime exceptions and given to you. So, in no place of your code you will be using try catch to handle these exceptions. The exceptions will be directly thrown to the console. Okay. Spring provides a consistent transaction management. Whenever you are working with applications where there are multiple layers, the transaction has to be maintained. If you want to create your own user-defined transactions, you need to use JTA, but in case of Spring, Spring is responsible for handling the transactions for you. Testing an application with Spring is easy because it is using Java Bean style POJOs. What is Java Bean? Just now we have seen employee class. A Java Bean is a public class with private instance variables, public getter setter methods, one default constructor. So in case of Spring, you will be working with Java Bean style POJOs only. Remember, when I say POJO, the classes doesn't extend any other external classes. The classes doesn't implement any other external interfaces. They are called as POJOs, plain old Java objects. Okay. Now, let us see the modules that are available in Spring Framework. I'll just do a quick run through of the modules. So this is the Spring architecture. You can see in the bottom layer there is test. Above that we are having core container. The core container has 4 modules: beans, core, context and spell. That is Spring expression language. If you want to develop only standalone or console based application, it is enough that you can work with Spring core module. Okay. Now, if you want to integrate your Spring application with the database, then you need to use the data access module. As I told you, you can either pick and choose JDBC module or ORM. ORM means Object Relational Mapping. In our case, it is Hibernate. Using Hibernate, I can connect to the database. Or OXM. OXM means Object XML Mapping if you are working with XML. JMS means Java Messaging Services, Transactions. Transactions are already taken care by Spring Framework. So this is your data access module. Now coming here, if you want to create a web application using Spring Framework, it is enough that you add Spring Web module. Other than that, you are having AOP, aspects, instrumentation, messaging. These are for providing aspect orientation for your application. This is the slide which I have got. I will be sharing you this slide in the WhatsApp group. You can take the slide from there. So these are the modules. Each module is discussed in detail. You can go through this. Okay. Now let us enter into the main topic, that is IoC Container. These are the topics we will be discussing now. What is IoC? What is the meaning of an IoC container? The 2 IoC containers that are available. What is a Spring Bean? What is configuration metadata? I will explain it with a nice pictorial representation. Then you will get a big picture of how Spring Framework works. Okay. What is IoC? IoC means inversion of control. It is a technique for decoupling the components and layers in an application. Okay. Now let me explain it with a pictorial representation. Suppose say I have 2 classes. One is my employee class, the other one is address class. Already we have seen this example. Employee class has address as instance variable. So the address object has to be created and added to the employee object either using the constructor or using the setter method. In these scenarios, there is a tight coupling between the classes, between the employee class and address class. As a Java developer, you might have encountered these kind of scenarios. But now, using the concept of IoC, inversion of control, the control is reversed. Meaning to say that the dependencies needed for a class will be injected automatically by the framework. How? Again, either using the constructor or using the setter method. Okay. So, this concept is called as IoC. Now, all these are correct. But how Spring will know that I need to create an object and inject the dependency to that particular object? Let us see the pictorial representation. So, this is my IoC container, inversion of control container. Now, as a Java developer, in my application, I have created many Pojo classes. In our case, as of now, it is employee and address. Okay. Now, I need to inform the IoC container what are the classes that are available, what are the dependencies for these classes, and what are the objects that has to be created by the IoC container. So, those things are given by something called as configuration metadata. It can be either in the form of XML or annotations or Java based configuration, that is Java classes. So, what is the meaning of it? When you want some system to work, you need to feed in data, right? Suppose if you want something to be printed, you need to feed in the paper and the ink that is needed for your printer. Only then you will get the printout. Similarly, in my application, that is in my Spring application, I need to feed in the Java classes that are available in my application to the IoC container. Together with that, I need to feed in the configuration metadata. It can be either in the form of XML or annotations or Java based configuration. Now, XML is outdated, so we will not be using it. Okay. What is the meaning of annotation? Now, in my case, I have two classes. I want the IoC container to create objects for these two classes. What should I do? I can simply go in for an annotation called as add component. Above the address class also I will add component. So, what the IoC container will do? It will go through this particular package, see the classes that are annotated with add component, and it will create objects for all these classes. But in my case, my employee class is dependent on address. How will I inform the IoC container that the employee is dependent on address? So, for that, there is one more annotation called as auto-wired. Means automatically wire the dependencies to the object. So, here automatically the address object will be wired to the employee object. I hope it is clear. Now, the IoC container is reading through the packages, identifying the classes that are annotated with add component. It has to create objects for those classes. Now, it is coming to address class. Add component is available. So, it will create object. Next, it is coming to the employee class. Add component is available. But employee is dependent on address because you have used auto-wired. So, what it will do is either using the constructor or using the setter method, it will inject the address object that is created into the employee object. Suppose if I am using setter method, first it will create the employee object and then it will call the setter method to inject the address object into the employee object. Okay. So, whatever we have been doing in the form of coding will be taken care by Spring Framework. It will write the code and it will create the objects. So, you can use auto-wired above the setter method or above the constructor or above the instance variable. Going forward, we will be learning all this. I hope this pictorial representation is very clear. So, this is IoC container. So, now till now we have been telling IoC container. What exactly it is? They are nothing but two main interfaces which are available in the context package. One is Bean Factory and the other one is application context. Both of them are IoC containers. Technically, they are interfaces. These two interfaces are responsible for creating the objects that are needed for your application. Either you can use Bean Factory or you can use application context. What is the difference between them? Bean Factory is the top level interface. Application context is the sub interface of Bean Factory. This has more functionalities and features compared to Bean Factory. Okay. Now you have understood what is an IoC container and what are the two IoC containers that are available. So, these two IoC containers are responsible for creating the objects and injecting the dependencies needed for these objects in an application. Okay. Now, what are these objects called? These objects are called as Spring Bean. A Spring Bean is a Java object which is instantiated and configured by the IoC container. In our case, the employee object and address object are called as Spring Bean. Okay. Now let me go back to the slide. So the two IoC containers are Bean Factory and application context. These are the packages to which they belong. Bean Factory is the top level interface. Application context is the sub interface of Bean Factory and it is responsible for instantiating, configuring and assembling the beans. What is a bean? A Spring Bean is nothing but a Java object created and configured by the IoC container. Okay. There are many implementations of application context available. While doing the program, we will see that. Okay. Let us see the pictorial representation. As I told you, this is the IoC container. These are the Java Pojo classes and this is the metadata configuration. My dear guys, just like how you are working in Java, you will be working in Spring. The only thing that Spring is doing for you is creating the objects that are needed for your application. Nothing more than that. Okay. Going forward, when you are working with Spring Boot, we will be learning about the advanced configurations. Rather than you creating the object and injecting the dependencies, the IoC container is responsible for doing all this. I will give you a similar analogy. If you are working in a company or if you are studying, after you go home, if you are staying alone, it means that you need to do the cooking and take care of the house all by yourself. This is similar to a Java application where you need to create the objects and inject the dependencies. But if you have appointed a cook or a maid at home, when you go home, all the work is done for you, the food is ready for you. Meaning to say that most of the work is done for you. Similarly, if you are working in a Spring application, the objects needed for your application will be created and kept ready for you. But as a developer, it is your duty that you need to write the logic and perform the other operations. Okay. So, what is a Spring Bean? A Spring Bean is a Java object that is instantiated, assembled and configured by the IoC container. Okay. What are the objects? How they have to be created? What are the dependencies of these objects? Everything is provided by configuration metadata. In our case, we will be working with annotations. Okay. Now, you need to know how to configure your IoC container. Guys, when you are working with Spring Boot, the IoC container also will be created by Spring Boot. But now we have started only with Spring Framework. So, in this case, it is our duty that we need to create the IoC container. I don't want to push on multiple concepts in one single day. We will be doing a simple program on day 3. During that time, I will explain how to create the IoC container and how to get the objects created by the IoC container. So, while doing the program, we will understand that part. Okay. So, we have completed the fundamental concepts of Spring Framework. So, guys, I will stop here. I don't want to push you with multiple topics. At the end of this video, you should be confident with the fundamental concepts. You should know what is Spring Framework, what are the advantages of Spring Framework, what is the meaning of dependency injection, what is IoC containers, the two types of IoC containers, what is the Spring Bean and the Spring modules. You might have heard about the types of dependency injection and much more things. We will be covering it in step by step in the upcoming videos. If you are having any doubts related to these topics, you can ask them in the comment section or in the WhatsApp group. I am always happy to help. Let us learn, code and grow together. That's it. Thank you.